to to the Native American caucus. We have a Native American caucus here at the legislature. We started that about 5 or 6 years ago. And we have only 3 Native Americans in the state legislature. So what we did was, when we formed the Native American caucus, we invited everybody. Otherwise, it'll just be a caucus of 3. And that's probably not a bad idea, but we have to work with other folks, so we invited all of them basically to educate them on different issues affecting Indian people within the state of Arizona. As you know, Indian people are also citizens of the state and therefore entitled to all the benefits and privileges that are extended to other citizens of the state of Arizona. But a lot of our colleagues have very little knowledge about issues affecting Native American people here within the state. So our purpose at the Native American Caucus was to provide a forum where issues such as gaming, redistricting, Indian law, and topics of that nature can be discussed. And we have presenters who come in to do presentations on those issues. And it has been helpful in terms of educating our colleagues, and hopefully that by that information and expansion of their knowledge, they're able to make informed decisions on issues that arise on the floor, either here or across over at Senator Jackson's chamber. So that being the case, this Wednesday would have been our another caucus meeting with another issue, but we decided that instead of that, we'll just host you all here, host the forum. And we are honored to do that. And I'd like to introduce some folks who are very helpful in that area. Cynthia Aragon, who you see running around, the young lady who's sitting back there, she's one of the legislative aides, and they do a lot of analysis of bills that are coming before us and presents us with those bills. And she is very capable and has helped us ever since we started the Native American Caucus. And of course, Melissa Upshaw, who's my administrative assistant, and Jack will introduce his administrative assistant. So those are the folks who helped us, and one individual I want to extend appreciation to is Ron Lee, who is the only Native American lobbyist that I know here and across the country. So he is a lobbyist and does a lot of work for Native American entities and others, and he provided some funds so we can provide some refreshments for you this morning. Of course, we also, Senator Jackson and I also pitched in to do that. And have a good time, and I'm sure the presentations are going to be informative and exciting, and we're looking forward to that. And thank you very much for coming to this area. And I want to also say one other thing, which is to also extend thanks to the Speaker of the House, Andy Tobin, for consenting to and allowing us to use the chambers here. And I want to thank him also. I thanked him yesterday when we had a meeting with him on some other matters. And thank you again for coming to join us, and have a productive day. May the holy people be with you always. Thank you very much.
Yate Bene. Good morning. How's everybody this morning? It's great to see everybody here in your state capital. It's always an honor when we have Native people make their presence and their voices heard in these great halls here at the House of Representatives, as well as my chamber across the lawn here at the State Senate. Yate She Jack Jackson Jr. yin she Tohanen and Shinto Kiani Bashachin Tabahan Dashache Anshin Dashanella Say Gahodzana Dith Nasha. Wanted to Before I get started, acknowledge former state Representative Albert Tom in the back, also from the Navajo Nation. Mr. Tom, it's great to see you. I understand when you were here in these chambers, you also hosted a similar forum, and so it's a great honor to be able to continue the great work that you have done. And so it was our honor when Tupac and Mr. Newcomb asked the Native American Caucus, Representative Hale and Representative Sally Ann Gonzalez and I, who make up the Native American Caucus. We chair the Native American Caucus, actually. The caucus itself is, as Mr. Hale stated, belongs to everyone, and so we try to provide opportunities during session to have folks come and hear on issues important to the tribes here in Arizona, the 22 tribes. I'm very excited to be here this morning. We, I think, are in our 9th week of our second session of this 50th legislature, and have been working pretty hard at getting those bills passed, and hopefully we'll work on our budget here shortly and be able to leave to our respective legislative districts. I understand that what you're going to be doing here is very important this morning, and I look forward to being part of the discussion and hearing from all the great speakers that we have lined up, and more importantly, to be able to formulate a report that will be used at the UN in their discussions this summer. So what we're doing here this morning is very important. And really don't have much more to add to what Representative Hale has stated, but just wanted to take the opportunity to again welcome you all here. One thing I do want to mention, the work that Mr. Hale and I and Sally Ann and other folks do here at the state legislature is to, of course, address issues important to our constituents. And Mr. Hale Representative Hale did state that we represent in our legislative districts 5 tribal governments, the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, San Juan Paiute, the Havasupai, and the Wallapai tribes. And so those are sort of the concerns that we bring to the table here at the state legislature. And one thing that I'm very excited about that Mr. Hale, Representative Hale and I have worked on is legislation that actually awaits the full approval of the House. It's passed out of the Senate. And that would ask the governor to sit with both bodies of the legislature to elevate the Arizona Commission on Indian Affairs to a cabinet level position. I think that with the 22 tribes and the over 300,000 Native Americans who reside in Arizona, we really need to have a place at the table with the governor, office of the governor, when she's making those important decisions impacting all of the states. So I believe that tribal leaders are very supportive of it, and I think that when this happens, the state of Arizona will become the second state to have that high-level Department of Indian Affairs. New Mexico is the first state, and they are doing some really great work in fostering a better relationship between the tribes in New Mexico and the state of New Mexico. So we look forward to that opportunity, and also with the work that we're doing here on an international front. I think that bringing it here to your chamber, the House of Representatives, really adds much more credence to what we're going to be doing here today. So again, thank you very much. Have a great, productive day. I look forward to all of the discussions this morning. Ahihab.
It's me again. Sorry, I forgot to mention a couple of other things. I mentioned my administrative assistant who just arrived on the floor. That's Melissa Upshaw. She's from Oak Springs, up near Window Rock. And the other thing is that we have the assistance pages during our regular session, and we have assistance of pages also today. So if you have anything that you need to have assistance with, from a page about, Clarissa is here to help us. So don't hesitate to raise your hand and call her over, and she will run and get you whatever you need, a piece of paper or whatever, a pencil or whatever. And then we also have, over to my right, Ryan, who will be looking out there, and if you press one of those buttons, they're inside that little hole in front of you. There's a little piece, a thing with 3 buttons on there. If you push the white button, they'll show up over here, and they'll turn the mic, your microphone on to where you're sitting. So there's a couple of things that I've neglected to mention. So again, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. Go now.
Thank you, Mr. Hale. I don't know how long I've known Mr. Hale, but he's always calls me Cheyenne. I don't know if I should be offended, or I love that guy. But again, thank you, gentlemen, Senator and Representative Hale, so much for your work. And I do also want to acknowledge Mr. Tom. Mr. Tom was, when Tupac and I first approached the House of Representatives, Mr. Tom back there was instrumental in moving our agenda forward. Since the time of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, many activities have taken place within the state of Arizona. And that work specifically comes from the folks at Tonatierra and the relationship with the O'odham people in moving forward the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Since then, Mayor Phil Gordon signed a proclamation recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day. The Salt River and the Gila River adopted proclamations acknowledging and affirming the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So a lot of activity has taken place within Arizona. However, there's a lot more to do. There's a lot of struggles that take place in the state of Arizona. We are one of the largest states in the Union, and we have the largest population of Indigenous peoples. There are many struggles that continue on Indigenous lands. There are many fights that go on with regards to water rights, to sacred sites, lands, and natural resources. But before I go any further, I want to remind or just let you know that there's an agenda change that we're going to have Professor Miller go on at 9:40. I know our time frame is a little off. We called it Indian time. They even have Indian time here at the state capitol. So I want to ask my brother Tupac to come up here briefly and to share with us a little bit about what our objectives are today here at this Indigenous Peoples Forum. Someone called me the other day and she said, "I'm a white girl, quote, can I come?" And I said, yes. It is important for all people of colors to listen to this forum today. There are many issues that we're going to be talking about. You're going to hear words like assimilation, relocation, ethnic cleansing, genocide. We're going to talk about things that are times maybe have never been brought up in this building. We are going to talk about things that are difficult still today and happening in Indian country. So if my brother Tupac, I've known him for too long. I think we're almost married by now. Maybe not that, but we've known each other for a long time and been involved in ceremony, in protest, and the advancement of the issues of Indigenous peoples here in Arizona. So I want to ask Tupac to come on up and speak about our objectives today here at the forum. Tupac.
Good day, good morning. With the permission, we'd like to also join the other relatives in the invocation for this forum. And the concept of a forum is a space where words, message, and meaning is exchanged. And the words and the message and the meaning of why we're here today is the purpose of our prayer. The prayer is our purpose. And with that, we would like to ask the permission to call upon as well, among the roots of our nations, among the foundations of our phrase, of our word, of our thought, of our mind, there is that prayer, there is that spirit. And with your permission, we would like to call upon them, call upon those, call upon our ancestry as part of the McIntosh to be with us and to participate with us and to guide us as we go forward in the day. And we will be brief. I'm sorry. Sorry, Roses. Every once 11 years, there's a cycle of the sun. And there's emanations that from the surface of the sun are ejected and travel towards our Earth, Mother Earth, and cause disruption among the communication systems and the media networks of today's society, of the world that we live in, this world that's being broadcast with these same technologies every 11 years. These counts of the daytimes, of the sun times, are part of our nature as indigenous peoples. They are part of our constitution. They are part of the reason why the time is now we are here doing what we are doing today. Every cycle of sun, some of them are day, some of them are by the year, some of them follow along with the count that is given by the moon when she reflects those message of the light of our Creator. And for that reason, this is again that day, the Nicantlaka Irwit, the day of the Indigenous Day. And one time when the Native American veterans came into this hall on October the 12th to sign that declaration, this was before Obama said he was going to be, before they came in here, the Native American veterans, this is a day of recognition too for their efforts. And they put their name, their testimony, and their will that these rights that are inscribed in this declaration would be part of the laws of the land, of the home of the braves, lands of the free. Every 11 years, every day, every year, every month, but there are also 26,000, more or less, cycles of years that we call the tonal, the way tonal, the cycles of the suns and the ages under which we have shared our foot trails and tracks on this Mother Earth, to where we now are emerging upon the sixth sun of our nationhood. And under that Constitution we come today. With that legislation we come today. Under that system of jurisprudence we arrive today. We present ourselves again today before all of you, before all of our relatives, to share these words with you. Once again, good morning. Kwalitanesi. Good greetings to all of you. This morning, I've been asked to share a brief message regarding the purpose and objectives of this Indigenous Peoples Forum on the impact of the doctrine of discovery. First of all, may I express my own personal gratitude to each of you for being present here today, and at the same time, with the same breath, may I also express my thankfulness and give honor to the spirit of our ancestors and relatives who have battled centuries of genocide and oppression in order to give us this opportunity today. Today we stand as nations and pueblos of indigenous peoples in regeneration of the role and responsibility that we share with all living beings to protect the sacredness of the natural world and the spirit of life itself. Today we stand in the face of challenges that extend from our own families and the local community on to the regional territory, from continental scale to global magnitude. We face now challenges that are unparalleled in all of human history. As global human society, we face the tipping point of global climate chaos. And in this we, there is no they. Until the adoption on September the 13th, 2007 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, barely 4 years, we're going to hit the 5th year this September. The indigenous peoples of Mother Earth were treated as roadkill on the highway of human civilization. Our nations, our territories, our flesh, our blood, our labor, our natural resources have been treated as raw material to be expropriated and exploited without any just consideration for our human rights or the rights of Mother Earth. Within the international law of the government states of the world order known as the UN system, our collective legal personality and cultural identity with corresponding inherent human rights and territorial rights as nations of indigenous peoples were not acknowledged nor respected. Within the UN system, we only existed as populations and not as peoples, minority groups and not as nations. We were regarded as cultural relics. Denial, discrimination, and invisibility were the coins of the realm that were tossed our way in spite of the fact that we continue to be the most ancient of human societies. We are the roots of humanity itself at the planetary level. Even our treaties with the government states, which provide unequivocal evidence and testimony to our nationhood and rights of sovereignty, have been subverted and domesticated like cognitive chattel under the justifications of the Marshall Trilogy, there to rot and decay into the oblivion of human conscience that is the doctrine of discovery. On September the 13th, 2007, this reality collapsed, and a new yet ancient truth, the truth of the sun, the truth of the light of the Nicantraca Idwi, the day of the indigenous, this time, this day. A new and ancient truth came once again to light. We as indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples. We as indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples. As such, we freely determine our own future, and in exercising the right of self-determination as peoples of the world, equal to all of the peoples, we also possess the right to our memory, to our past, to our history. What does this new context for the UN system mean in terms of the doctrine of discovery? What does it mean in terms of the continental systems of jurisprudence that derive from the doctrine of discovery? What does it mean in terms of policy and legislation for the United States as a member of the world community? What does it mean for Arizona? What impact will this forum have on the discussions to be had at the 11th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in May of this year, when the impact of the doctrine of discovery is to be an agenda item for discussion? Whatever the answers to these questions that may come forward as of today in response to the presentations given here at the Indigenous Peoples Forum on the Doctrine of Discovery, hosted by the Native American Caucus of the Arizona State Legislature and presided by the Otham Hemochkam, may we suggest that we have before us, what we have before us is not simply a set of questions, but the actualization of a new systemic standard to address these issues in terms of a context and a process that is an initiative of we, the indigenous peoples. Tejan Titraca. Today is a day of emergence. Today we break out of the constraints not only of the doctrine of discovery, but of doctrine itself. with the call to courage to all humanity. We look back, we call for the courage that is necessary in order to vision a new horizon for Mother Earth as she is reborn from the seas of emergence. The millennial journey of the nations and pueblos of indigenous peoples, guardians of Mother Earth, begins once again here today, guided in our quest by the spirit of self-determination and community sustainability. We look back now across the generations of our ancestors, and we look forward to the path of the future generations. And here now, Nicantraca, set our sights. We direct our leadership to engage with all our relations of the sacred Mother Earth, to let our path of self-determination be known. Let it be told, let it be respected, and let it be protected. It is not about what we want, it's what we will. As indigenous peoples, we are peoples equal to all other peoples, and our histories are equally part of the weave of human memory globally, and as such must be taken into account on an equal basis without discrimination to provide the necessary foundation for public policies of fairness and justice in education and the delivery of services of public health and public safety by the states. We call for this process to continue and to prevail in the spirit of truth over the distortions of doctrine, not merely for the purposes of redress of past violations, not merely for the purpose of redress of past violations, but to actually engage in collective corrective action in order to move forward with self-determination towards our common destiny as humanity and in maturity as children of the nations and pueblos of Mother Earth. Therefore, we direct that the record of this Indigenous Peoples Forum on the Doctrine of Discovery be presented to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for consideration in their discussion on this theme at the 11th session in UN headquarters in New York in May of 2012, and to the entire conscience of the world. Ayo. May we begin. Dasha Kamati, thank you.
Thank you, Tupac. Another change on the agenda is, unfortunately, Jose Matus could not make it, and we're going to ask a little later in the program our sister Monica Carrasco of Alianza Indigenous Sin Fronteras to come up and give us a brief overview of the work of the Alliance Against Borders, specifically addressing the Yoeme, or the Yaqui people. Many of you probably have never heard about the doctrine of discovery, and frankly, I never heard of it either until I got much older. I knew that I lived on a reservation. I knew that my people were Akamir people, and I knew that they had been there for centuries, if not millennia. But what I didn't know was that we were distinct peoples. What I didn't know was that we had ancient stories much different from those that came over on the Mayflower or the Nina or the Pinta or the Santa Maria. What I know today is that as an indigenous person, that we continually be marginalized and separated from the rest of society with regards to our rights. So today you're going to hear some of the most renowned people that have written and spoke about the doctrine of discoveries and its impact on indigenous peoples, not only in this country, but throughout the Western Hemisphere. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Professor Robert Miller. He is from the Lewis and Clark University, and he's going to share with us his teachings and his wisdom about the history of the doctrine of discovery. Professor?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Tupac and Shannon and everyone that was involved with inviting me to be here, and I'm delighted to get to speak with you on this topic. I am a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, and I'm the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals of the Grand Ronde Tribe in Oregon, and I'm also a judge for other tribes in the Pacific Northwest. I have been studying this topic for quite a few years now, and I'm delighted to be here and to talk with you about the doctrine of discovery. And as the title of the presentation today, the whole program, is the impact of the doctrine of discovery. And so I think I have a half an hour to talk to you about 500 years of history and law. So I'm going to talk really fast. First slide, please. We're going to take a look at this map today, and we're going to talk about manifest destiny. That's my assignment today, and that's what I wrote about in my 2006 book. And I described how the doctrine of discovery became manifest destiny. This American idea of what? I think most Americans know the phrase manifest destiny, but if you ask them to define it, they would not be able to. So that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to come back and forth to this map several times, because every one of those colored areas and the growth of the United States is explained by the principles, the elements of the doctrine of discovery. And my argument is that the United States adopted this international law of discovery that we're going to talk about and turned it into what we call today American manifest destiny. So we will come back and forth to that slide. Obviously, I live in the Oregon country, so we'll be talking about that. We're here now in this New Spain, what later became Mexico, and then what the United States acquired after the Mexican-American War. Next slide, please. So I'm going to very briefly describe the doctrine of discovery. Later, Steve Newcomb is obviously going to explain to us the European backgrounds and the definition of, the meaning of the doctrine of discovery and how it grows from ideas of domination. But I need to explain to you very briefly what the doctrine is, and then break it down into the 10 elements that I define describes the doctrine of discovery, and then we'll talk about how that became American manifest destiny. So in 1823, the first United States Supreme Court case to address Indian law issues was literally about what title, what ownership did tribes have of their lands. And this case was about what is now tribes in the area of Illinois and Indiana. It was, in fact, the Illinois tribe and the Piankashaw tribes, and it was their lands that were at question in this case. Of course, the tribe was not involved in the case. The tribes didn't have a lawyer in the case. These were two Americans arguing over lands that belonged to tribes. And here is what the United States Supreme Court ultimately held. This country, this court says, was founded and settled on the doctrine of discovery and of conquest. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But when Europeans walked ashore with their flag and their cross, folks, and stuck it in the sand, when Meriwether Lewis crossed the continent in 1803 to 1806 and carried a branding iron, I was at the Oregon Historical Society 2 days ago, and they had the original Meriwether Lewis branding iron. And as he crossed the country, once they crossed the Rockies, Meriwether Lewis starts branding his name. It says U.S. CAPT, because he was a captain in the Army, M. Lewis. And they start carving their names on trees and sandstone cliffs, and Lewis starts branding his name. Gee, it sounds like he was sticking his flag and cross in the soil, doesn't it? He was claiming the Oregon country for the United States, plainly, and using principles that Johnson v. McIntosh reaffirmed in 1823. So next slide. What did it mean when European countries showed up with their flag and cross? What allegedly happened to native peoples? Well, here's what the court said. Native peoples immediately lost some of their property rights. They no longer were considered the fee simple absolute owner, which is an Anglo-American property law principle. When you and I buy our homes, we're the fee simple absolute owner. But this court said that by the magic of Europeans showing up, or Meriwether Lewis out in my area branding trees, tribal governments somehow, crazily, lost their full ownership and rights in their lands. What else did they lose? Well, the court says they also lost some of their sovereign powers. They lost their international powers because indigenous nations were no longer supposed to trade internationally or engage in international diplomacy. They were now only supposed to deal with that European country that discovered them. How ironic that is, folks. As you know, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, they were lost everywhere they went. Every Indian person they ran into, they said, "Where are we and what's up the road?" But oh no, we, American history, characterized that the natives were discovered. How ludicrous. But that is what we're dealing with. We have to understand the law of the United States, the federal Indian law of the United States, to understand the impact then of the doctrine of discovery on us today as Native peoples and on our governments. Let's see, so next slide. One more. So I break the doctrine of discovery down into 10 elements, and the pages, thank you very much, are handing out 2 handouts I brought. I obviously didn't bring enough, so I think they're making some copies. But I give you the elements that I think comprise the doctrine of discovery. How did Europeans make a legal claim under international law, under the papal bulls that Steve will talk to you later from 1436, 1452, 1455, that divided the world for Spain and Portugal? Wow. I guess I wish I'd have been Spanish or Portuguese back then when the Pope divided the world for just those 2 countries. But here's the elements that I argue make up the doctrine of discovery and how a European country, and later the United States, made claims over Native peoples. 1, you had to be the first European or American to show up. So how'd you prove that? Gosh, maybe that's why Meriwether Lewis carried a branding iron with him. How else did Europeans show where they had showed up first? Well, they mapped the areas. They named rivers, mountains, and various features. Remember what Lewis and Clark did? They named every single river they encountered. Gee, what's that Pike's Peak that's in Colorado? Do you know who Pike is? That's Lieutenant Zebulon Pike that was sent by Thomas Jefferson in 1805 to explore the parameters, the limits of the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory. Go back to the map, please. Look at the territory of what we call the Louisiana Territory, folks, and look at the Oregon country. Have you ever pondered what makes those boundaries? Well, the boundaries are the drainage systems of those major rivers. The Mississippi River, the drainage system, comprises the territorial boundaries of the Louisiana Territory. In 1804, after concluding the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson spent the summer of 1804 home at Monticello trying to figure out how large the drainage system of the Mississippi River was. Why do you think he directed Meriwether Lewis to go to the very headwaters of the Missouri River, and also directed him to go to the northernmost tributary of the Missouri? Because he was trying to determine the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike, that I just mentioned, was sent along the Arkansas River, and he ends up in Colorado, modern-day Colorado, and lo and behold, he finds a mountain named Pike's Peak. What irony! I just can't believe that. But he also was sent to the headwaters of the Mississippi. And President Jefferson also sent an expedition along the Red River, Dunbar and Scott. So Jefferson was trying to determine the boundaries, and he was using the international law of discovery to do that. Because I got a little bit ahead of myself, so I get excited when I give this talk. But we'll see in a moment, one of the elements of discovery is what explains why you use the drainage systems of rivers. So Jefferson tried to calculate when the French found the mouth of the Mississippi, and of course, the United States claimed the Oregon country because we found the Columbia River first, then Meriwether Lewis and William Clark crossed the continent and lived at the mouth of the Columbia for several months, and Americans allegedly settled it first. Please back down to the elements. Thank you. Okay, so first discovery. You had to find it first. You had to somehow prove that to the world. Then Queen Elizabeth I in 1587 developed this other element of the doctrine of discovery. Just finding it wasn't good enough. You had to actually occupy these newly claimed lands within a reasonable length of time. So that's what I call my element of actual occupancy. So you had to build a fort, you had to build a settlement, you had to get some people there, and to show the world that you had not only found it first, but you now were occupying it. Next element. What did Europeans acquire? Well, Thomas Jefferson called the doctrine of discovery preemption. The United States' very first Congress, folks, you've probably all heard of the Trade and Intercourse Acts that the Congress enacted to limit tribal rights, Indian rights. The first Congress used the word preemption in the very first Trade and Intercourse Act, July the 22nd, 1790. So our founding fathers, those people that helped draft the Constitution and started this country, they understood this legal principle. They knew the claims that the United States were making over native peoples, and they knew it came from this ancient, crazy idea that Europeans could show up and claim the rest of the world. Usually when I give the longer version of this speech, I pick someone from the front row and I ask them, where do you live? I'm coming over today with the Bob Miller flag and the Bob Miller religious symbol, and I'm going to claim her house. What's she going to do? What's the number for 911 here? Do you have a gun? I'm going to be insane, aren't I, if I think I can show up at her house and claim it. That's what Europeans did. That's what this international law of discovery did. So when we're talking about the impact on indigenous peoples, folks, it was the colonization, it was the domination of European civilizations and religions of the rest of the world. Oh, excuse me, one more. So European title, that was this overall claim that the Europeans now owned the land. In Johnson v. McIntosh, the Supreme Court says about 10 or 12 times that the United States owns the ultimate title, the sole title, the exclusive title of Indian lands, even though Indian peoples were still living on the lands, using the lands, and had been there for millennia. The United States had the chutzpah, the hubris, whatever word you want to use, to show up and claim it. So the Indian title, what was the tribe left with? Well, Johnson v. McIntosh tells us. Tribes lost the full ownership of their lands, but they still had the right to occupy and use their lands. So they could still live there, but they had lost the complete title, and the United States still owns it. Folks, you know that's still the law today, right? Tribes own what is called the beneficial title of trust lands. 56 million acres of land in the lower 48 states are owned by tribes in trust status. That means the United States is the legal owner of their lands. The tribe is the beneficial owner. As you all well know, any tribe that wants to sell, lease, or develop their land has to ask the Secretary of Interior to approve that decision. Because under the doctrine of discovery and Johnson v. McIntosh, the United States is deemed to be the legal owner. 11 million acres of land is owned by individual Indians in the lower 48 states in trust status due to the allotment era. Those Indian peoples are the beneficial owner of those 11 million acres. The United States is the legal owner because of the doctrine of discovery. So this is not just some old interesting thing that happened in history. We live this today as Indian people. So what were tribes left with? Well, we already saw what Johnson v. McIntosh said is the tribes lost their full sovereignty. They lost their independence and self-determination. And so the doctrine of discovery says that tribes have only limited sovereignty, only limited commercial rights. Wow, limited sovereignty. Well, that's, of course, we know the Supreme Court of the United States says that every year in every case they decide. Contiguity, I finally got to the element about how big of an area did Europeans claim when they stuck their flag and cross in the soil. And we don't need to go back to the map because we already did that, but look at how big of a claim France allegedly had to the entire drainage system of the Mississippi River just because a Frenchman showed up at the mouth of the Mississippi in 1685 and did that charade. Look at the claim the United States made to own the entire Oregon country, all of modern-day British Columbia, all of my state, Oregon, Washington, and part of Idaho, et cetera, because an American sailed up the mouth of the Columbia River in 1792. Wow, I'm coming to your house tonight with my flag and symbol. Next. Here's element 7 and 8 as I describe the doctrine of discovery. After reading Johnson v. McIntosh about 100 times, these are the 10 justifications, the 10 elements for the doctrine of discovery. Terra nullius, Latin words that just mean an empty land. Europeans acted as if lands that Indians were using were empty and they could claim the lands. This principle was used most vigorously in Australia, where the British government pretended not to see the Aboriginal peoples, said they don't use land, they're not here, Australia's empty, we can claim it. Australia rejected this principle, the Australian Supreme Court in the Mabo case in 1992. That's a pretty dramatic statement, and it does show that the doctrine of discovery can be resisted, can be fought, and changes can be made today. So that's why these efforts and what's going on at the UN Permanent Forum are important. Conquest. How does the court define conquest? Because the Illinois and Piankashaw tribes that were involved in the Johnson v. McIntosh decision had not fought a war with the U.S. They had not been conquered in a war. Now, the paper that I send you around, I think the Johnson v. McIntosh defines this word in two ways. One, yes, if a European power or the U.S. fought a war with a tribe and won, then it acquired the rights of warfare under European military law. But I think Johnson v. McIntosh defines the word conquest in a second way, what we might call a term of art. The moment Europeans showed up with their flag and their cross, they acquired all these same rights as if they had won a military battle. So I think that's how Johnson v. McIntosh describes conquest. Later American laws use this same idea. Later American laws, folks, use all of these ideas against American Indians. My last two elements, doctrine of discovery, civilization and Christianity. There is no question that European powers thought they were superior, thought they were bringing great benefits to native peoples around the world, and the papal bulls that Steve will talk to you about, of course, is all about this subject. The quotations I could cite you folks throughout American history of our presidents, our secretaries of state, people in Congress, local citizens, newspapers, they all bragged that Americans were bringing civilization and Christianity to these heathen, pagan American Indian peoples. So these 10 principles are what I think make up the doctrine of discovery. And so when I was writing this book in 2004 and 2005, I don't know when I started to think, well, gee, what is manifest destiny, and did it come directly from these same ideas? And that's exactly the conclusion I came to. And I used these 10 elements to analyze American history and the statements that were made by politicians and citizens and newspapers, etc., to understand what manifest destiny is and was and how it was justified. So I've totally lost track of my time. I have another hour, right, Shannon? Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Sit back, relax. I've got another hour. Let's get to the manifest destiny. What is it? I said earlier that I bet every American knows the phrase, but I bet they don't really know what it means. So next. This definition is what historians say, not me. This isn't the Bob Miller definition of manifest destiny. This is what most historians agree on. The United States has some special virtue as human beings and as institutions. You've probably all heard the phrase that we think we're this shining city on a hill. I think that was written by some New England minister in like 1640, or 60. So in 1660, we thought we were something special. And I think we still think that today, don't we? I don't want to get myself in trouble, but anyway, next point. We have a mission to remake the world in our image. Now, folks, I hope I'm not being taped because I don't want to say this on tape, but this is what we said about our Iraq War number 2, didn't we? We were going to bring democracy to the Middle East. I'll just leave my comments right there. And the third one. And we're doing it under God's direction. Now remember, this is the definition that U.S. historians give to manifest destiny. This isn't mine. So, I looked at that and I thought, well, let's analyze the doctrine of discovery elements with this definition of manifest destiny, and let's see what we find out. So let me take you back. The word manifest destiny was not used for the first time to anyone's knowledge until July of 1845. A New York editorial writer wrote about Texas and that the United States owned Texas because it was our manifest destiny to own Texas and because God wanted us to own Texas. Wow, that made me think of the Doctrine of Discovery just a little bit. 6 months later, he uses the phrase manifest destiny in regards where I live, the Oregon country. And you need to read a whole paragraph that he wrote in his editorial. He says, it is our manifest destiny to own the Oregon country. And he then used, please go back to the 10 elements. If you, not all of them, yeah, great, thank you. You should read just one paragraph of his editorial encompasses all 10 of these justifications. A newsman, John L. O'Sullivan, in 1845, coins this phrase manifest destiny and says the United States already owns the Oregon country. And he almost walks through these. He says, we discovered it first. Under international law, it's ours. Our people are out there occupying it. We deserve it. We're bringing Christianity and civilization to the wild savages, etc., etc., etc. He uses this. You know, the phrase manifest destiny was repeated within a week on the floor of the House of Representatives. I believe it was on January the 7th, 1846, a congressman stated that phrase. And this idea, manifest destiny, just swept the country. Oh yes, we are God's elite. We deserve to own the whole continent. Now what I want to tell you folks is this is nothing new. This idea that Americans were special, yes, started in 1640. This idea that Americans were going to sweep the continent started with George Washington, started with Thomas Jefferson, all the presidents and Secretary of States long before John L. O'Sullivan writes the word manifest destiny. In fact, let me tell you that, you know, our 13 original colonies, 7 of them are called landed colonies because the charter that the kings of England gave them granted them the land in North America clear to the South Sea. Well, that was their title of the Pacific Ocean at that time. Now, they didn't know if the Atlantic to the Pacific was 10 miles or 3,000 miles. But still, the kings of England were granting those kind of ownership to the colonies. And they continued to claim those and only gave them up as late as 1802. The early 5 minutes. I thought you said I had. Okay, well, 5 minutes. I got to talk fast. The main two things. Okay, so we claimed the whole United States. You know what General George Washington said in 1783? He was only a general then, and he was asked by the Congress, how should we deal with the native peoples? Should we fight a war with them, or what should we do? General Washington makes a very famous statement, folks, that I think was American federal Indian policy until probably 1970. George Washington coined a phrase, the savage as the wolf. And you can read his letter today. It's online. He writes, James Duane, one of the senators, and here's his recommendation. We don't have to fight Indian people, he said, because we will get their lands as soon as we want and when we are ready to get them. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he goes, what happens to the animals of the forest as we advance our frontier? He says, they disappear, don't they? Then he says, it is the same with the savage, quote, the savage as the wolf, close quote. So what Washington was saying is that Indian people will disappear in front of us like the snow disappears before the sun. And that idea was repeated throughout American history, and literally, I believe, what was the termination era about, folks, in the 1950s? Indians are gone, they're disappearing, they're on their way out. But now, in this self-determination era, now in this era where tribes are exercising their authority and their sovereignty, the United States is going, wow, what happened? But that's what George Washington foretold. Do you know what Thomas Jefferson said, President Jefferson? He said that we will drive the Indians along with the beasts of the forest into the Rocky Mountains. So he had the same idea that this continent was for Americans and indigenous peoples were to be gotten rid of. Gosh, you all know what the removal era of federal Indian policy is. Thomas Jefferson was the architect of it. He was writing about it in private letters in 1803, long before Andrew Jackson was president and long before the Removal Act was enacted in 1830. Okay, well, I have too much to say. But this idea, oh, well, I got to mention this. Do you know what our founding fathers' favorite Bible scripture was? I have read this. You thought, how'd this guy get on a Bible? Genesis 1:28 was the favorite scripture of the English colonists and our founding fathers. And in case you don't remember what Genesis 1:28 says, that's the verse that says something about God tells man to fill the earth, multiply, and subdue it. And this subduing of the earth was very much what the colonists were into, and they wanted the possession of it and to use it to the best and highest use, of course. Okay, I need to wrap up here very quickly. I want to emphasize President James K. Polk. I literally at breakfast this morning, the people at the next table were talking about James K. Polk. And you go, why is he talking about James K. Polk? Back to the map, please. James K. Polk runs for president as the Democratic representative in 1844. The Democratic Party platform in 1844 said, we are going to grab Texas. We're going to grab the Oregon country because God meant us to have it and it's ours. James K. Polk runs on the campaign slogan, folks. How many of you remember this? 54-40 or fight. What the heck was he talking about when he said 54-40 or fight? You know you don't run for president with a slogan no one knows, right? So today we forgot it. But everyone alive in 1844 knew what that meant. He wouldn't have used the slogan. 54-40 or fight, folks, means that James K. Polk was using the doctrine of discovery, the international law principle of how large the Oregon country was and what claim the United States had to the Oregon country, because we found it first, then Lewis and Clark went there, and then John Jacob Astor builds Astoria and occupies it. Do you know where the 54th degree of parallel is today? It's the very tip of Alaska. We were claiming all of British Columbia and all that blue area because it's the drainage system of the Columbia River. So in 1844, when Polk runs for president, the people know what he's talking about. International law, these principles of how Euro-Americans claimed new territories just by showing up with their flag, or as Meriwether Lewis did with his branding iron. So please go to the last slide. I was going to read you a couple quotes from various, well, I've got to cite you this one. Henry Clay, who was Secretary of State of the United States in 1825, he was talking about American expansion. And he said, things aren't going to turn out so well for Indian people. Well, let's not try to, well, now can I find it? Shannon, you got me, hurry, James Clay Polk said, it is, and here's a quote, impossible to civilize Indians. ... They were destined to extinction, period, close quote. So that's what the United States Secretary of State thought in 1825, and that's what he said and wrote. The United States, American people have the right to all of this, and Native people are going to disappear. Gee, that's what George Washington said in 1783, isn't it? So manifest destiny was not a new idea, folks. It was just a repetition of these elements of the doctrine of discovery, this idea of European and Christian superiority and right to the entire world. And so I'll just end very quickly with this, because this is the Oregon country. How did the Oregon country become part of the United States? An American found it first, allegedly. First discovery. Robert Gray's boat, that was the name of his ship, folks, so he named the Columbia River after his ship to show the United States claim to the area. President Jefferson then sends Lewis and Clark across the continent and says, build your fort and live at the mouth of the Columbia River. Establish an American claim. And then John Jacob Astor, that American fur trader, tells President Jefferson, I'm thinking of building a trading post on the Pacific Ocean. Oh, maybe at the mouth of the Columbia River. So I don't know how many of you know my state of Oregon, but Astoria is still on the Oregon coast at the very mouth of the Columbia River. And Thomas Jefferson was delighted that an American company was going to build a permanent occupation there. Remember, that's one of the elements of the doctrine of discovery. So give me 30 seconds. What's the impact of the doctrine of discovery today? Every federal principle that you're aware of comes directly from the doctrine of discovery. What are the three fundamental principles of federal Indian law? Congress has plenary power over tribes and can do anything it wants to them. good or bad. Where does that come from? The doctrine of discovery, the power that Europeans claimed, and the limited authority of tribes. Second, the trust responsibility. Well, you've all heard that. Why does the United States assume this trust responsibility over tribes? Well, partially because the United States claims this overarching power over Indians and indigenous peoples. And with overarching power comes a trust responsibility. And third, you all know the third fundamental principle, that tribal governments are sovereigns, but they're diminished sovereigns. Where does that come from? The 10 elements of the doctrine of discovery. So I wish I had another hour to talk to you, but I'm done. Thank you for your attention. The impact of the doctrine of discovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I know that as Indian people, boy, we like to talk. And it is very difficult when we are on a time frame to address such an important issue. But I like to take a few minutes to speak about this territory that all of you, if you are not O'odham, then you are a foreigner or an immigrant to this territory, to the original inhabitants of the O'odham people. The word O'odham Humachkum means the O'odham nations, or the people's nations. In fact, if we go back in history, we realize that the great American democracy could not be created without the annihilation and the assimilation of indigenous peoples, or the American Indians. History is written by the victors. Today, however, we want to tell a different story. And sometimes the history that we speak of about indigenous peoples is uncomfortable and basically is denied. In the United States, we don't like to talk about our history. We talk about the landing of Columbus and the Pilgrims, but we don't talk about the indigenous peoples. And because of that, tensions remain, racial tensions, racial divides, and it's hard for us to talk about injustice. In this country, we rarely talk about the American Holocaust. And I want to share with you a little bit about the word Holocaust. It originated in the 13th century, and it meant a sacrifice consumed by fire or a burnt offering. In the 15th century, its definition changed slightly to great sacrifice or slaughter. And in the 16th century, we hear from the famous Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who used it in describing the ongoing massacre and mass destruction of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean islands and Latin America. Then, of course, in the 19th century, we hear about it again with the description of the Nazis' mass extermination of the Jews. And again, with the slaughter of the 5,000 Armenians in eastern Turkey. But this morning, I want to focus about the history of the indigenous peoples, and specifically here, the O'odham people. The O'odham people, and that is slightly, I'm using English words, so O'odham means person or human being. And this morning, what you saw and what you heard was the language, O'odham Nyok, and a prayer from our uncle, Jonah Ray. It is the ancient language of our people. And I want to focus a little bit on the history of how Arizona came to be and how we were impacted by Christianity and Catholicism. In the 1680s, a gentleman by the name of Acebo Father Kino came trotting through here. And with him, he brought soldiers, a Bible, and a cross, and a flag. And what he described as he came across, he called it Pimaria Alto. And he described it as the rim of Christendom. And through his years of contact with indigenous peoples and indigenous nations, the Opata, the Siri, the Yavapai, the Kumeyaay, and of course, the Hitchot O'odham, the Akamir O'odham, the Tono O'odham, and the Onk Akamir O'odham. The Spanish crown, of course, paid for his expedition, and he moved throughout our territory with relative ease. But there was never any peace between the indigenous peoples, specifically the O'odham. And in 1684, the O'odham started to realize that they were losing their land and their territory and their autonomy. And so in 1695, just 10 short years later, there brought what the beginning of what they are now titled as the Pima Revolts. And finally, the major revolt by the O'odham, or the Pima Revolts, in the 1750, where several hundred O'odhams uprised against the Spanish in Altar Valley, in what is now known as Sonora. But we need to move fast, we need to move forward about 100 years. 100 years in the 1840s, the O'odham were living again after the uprising and the revolts of pushing back the Spaniards and keeping them at bay to some degree, lived in relative harmony. They were growing corn, squash, beans, pumpkin, tapery beans, lima beans. And we are the early descendants. We are the descendants of the Huogam people, those that have gone before us. And like them, we had the abundance of mesquite beans, cactus fruit, and small game. And in the 1840s, we were wealthy compared to American standards. We grew wheat and corn, and we were the first entrepreneurs in what is known as Arizona. With the California gold rush in 1847 to 1852, 40 to 60,000 Mexican and Anglo-Americans traveled past our territory, and we sold over 2.3 million pounds of wheat and corn to those that traveled through. And I want to emphasize the word traveled through. They passed. Arizona was known to be very hot as it is today, but the O'odham people kept somewhat their boundary. But in 1853 and several years later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase changed everything. The O'odham people became isolated, and they became reservation Indians. And the border of Mexico and what is now known as Arizona separated our O'odham people. At that time, we had the freedom to move back and forth. Today, it is a much different story. But during the 1840s, 50s, and throughout the early 1900s, the settlement of rich farmland upstream by non-Indian people began, and the diversion of the Gila River started. And because of that, the indigenous peoples, the O'odham people, seen what they was titled as the years of the Great Famine. It was in 1869 was first recorded shortage of water, which created hostilities again with the Mexican and Anglo-Americans. In 1872, our chief Antonio Azul took his concern to Washington, and at Washington he was met with a proposal to move all the O'odham people to Oklahoma. That didn't happen. So around that same time, 1,200 O'odham people moved over to what is now known as the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. In 1903, Azul again appealed for aid because of the shortage and the drought that was taking place in O'odham territory. This time he appealed directly to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was not a friend to indigenous peoples. So today what you have is the Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Indian Community, Lehigh, the Tono O'odham Nation, and then the O'odham people that live south of the Mexico border. Consequently, what happened with the diversion and the building of the Coolidge and Roosevelt Dam, the O'odham people and their population became one of the sickest in the world because of commodity foods and distribution of canned foods. The highest rate of diabetes recorded anywhere among indigenous populations throughout the world. I wanted to share that brief history with you because you today sit in the territory of the O'odham people, and I want to welcome the large number of students that just walked in to hear the history of Arizona, what you know as Arizona. So when the idea was brought before Representative Hale and Senator Jackson, there were some concerns about the language that would be used in this building, about the description of indigenous peoples, and how today indigenous peoples are still marginalized. They still struggle for their basic rights, their fundamental and human rights. Indigenous peoples live on reservations. Poverty is still high, and over the summer in the last year or so, you heard the discussions about the 1%. The 1% that said unemployment is too high, and it is 9, 12, and at times 15%. But I ask you to look on the reservations where unemployment is as high, maybe as high as 75%. Why does that happen? And how does it happen? And I ask you to think about the natural resources that light this very building today. The coal that comes from the Navajo Nation and the relationship that Peabody Coal and the Black Mesa Coal Company have between the relationship with the indigenous peoples and governments. Today our tribal governments are IRA governments, and they adopted the forms of the United States and their procedures, and they do not work for indigenous peoples. They have not worked. We still have, again, high levels of unemployment, high levels of suicide, alcoholism, and drug addiction. I wanted to just briefly say that to you because it is important to know where you sit today, where literally you sit. That this area And I asked my uncles this morning, Meldon and Jonah, what was this place called? And they said it was called Tonatierra, people's land. This was our land. We didn't describe it anything other than that. And that the Huugam, with their many canals and their many fields of prosperity, their livelihoods, all have vanished. So we are quarantined to reservations, maybe not so much, but because of who we are and our history, we become complacent in society. I want to thank Mr. Miller for giving us such a great presentation. And now I want to move on with the agenda. And I want to ask that, first I want to give you a little background. Sometime back, a gentleman was asked, he gave out a call for us to come and to attend a thing called the Divine Strike. And it was in the Western Shoshone Territory. And during that time, the United States government, the military, was going to detonate a bomb in the desert. And the concern of radioactivity and the spreading of radioactivity was a major concern to the Western Shoshone. So we came and we supported, and some of us got arrested. But the fight from the Western Shoshone Defense Project has been ongoing. And I'm going to ask Julie Kavanaugh Bill to come up and to share with us a little bit about the history of the Western Shoshone, the impact on the doctrine of discovery and its international context. We have known Julie for quite a while, and her husband, Larson Bill, and they are representatives of that nation, Larson Bill, and the Carrie Dan sisters, the Dan sisters, who have been fighting the U.S. government to recognize the Ruby Treaty. So I want to ask Julie to come up, and I want to ask you all to give her a round of applause and welcome her to Tonatierra.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Tupac. Thank you, everybody that's here. My name is Julie Kavanaugh Bill, as Shannon said. I'm not Shoshone by blood lineage. My husband is Western Shoshone, and I've lived in the territory now for a little over a decade. But my familiar background, my mother's family actually came here from Ireland. That's the Kavanaugh side. And my father's family came from Germany. And so I've been very privileged and honored to work with Indigenous peoples for several years now, and working especially with Mary and Carrie Dan, the late Corbin Harney, who actually I think was the one that gave the call for folks to join us in stopping Divine Strike. That was the nuclear test, it was an above ground detonation that would have stirred up all of this radioactive dust that is still down there at the Nevada test site. So it was a very serious situation, and with the help of folks from Tonatierra and around the world, actually, we stopped that detonation. So that was a huge victory, an amazing one. But as far as the Western Shoshone struggle, by training, I'm an attorney. That's how I got involved. I actually started working with James Anaya on the Western Shoshone case and taken it to different international forums. And this is after Mary and Carrie Dan and other Western Shoshone had attempted to find redress here in the United States and through the U.S. court system, eventually ending up in the U.S. Supreme Court, which informed them that once this Indian Claims Commission, which I don't know if Steve Newcomb will talk a little bit about that, but a quasi-judicial system was put in place by Congress under Congress's plenary power, which Professor Miller mentioned. Once they had issued a payment, the U.S. Supreme Court said once that payment was issued, you no longer can come to the U.S. courts and argue title. And the Dans and other Shoshone argued back and said, well, we never accepted that payment. And we weren't part of the group that went to the Indian Claims Commission in the first place. And even those people that went to the Indian Claims Commission didn't get full rights to due process. They didn't get the same rights that even non-Indians are given here in the United States. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? The Department of Interior is your trustee. And as your trustee, they can accept that payment on your behalf, which is what they did, even though they're suing you for trespass in the original litigation. And so therefore, you have no access to courts here in the United States. We took this to the international level, first through the Indian Law Resource Center, where Professor Anaya was working, and then through the University of Arizona, Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. And the international system was appalled. First, at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, back in 2002, we received a public 50-page decision from the Inter-American Commission. This is one of the most respected bodies of human rights in the world. And in that decision, they rejected all of the United States' arguments and said that U.S. was in current violation of due process, rights to property, and right to equality under the law, squarely rejecting U.S. federal Indian law and justification stemming from, as Professor Miller rightly pointed out, the doctrine of discovery. The U.S. acted like they potentially might talk, but basically told us this decision is not binding on us. And the State Department, Department of Justice, and Department of Interior attorneys met with us and said, we will not go any farther than what federal Indian law currently provides, which is nothing when it comes to looking at traditional territories and traditional rights. And just as a backdrop, those of you that aren't familiar, Western Shoshone territories recognized in a fully ratified treaty, the Treaty of Ruby Valley, and that treaty was signed in 1863 and then ratified by Congress. At the time, the U.S. Congress had actually convened, and there's legislative history where they informed the Indian agents going out to negotiate the treaty that they did not want to purchase the land. They were in the middle of a civil war. They wanted access to California to get gold to fund their civil war. They just wanted to get across what is now the state of Nevada, because some of you may know the gold we have in Nevada is microscopic for the most part. So at that time, they didn't realize there was the amount of gold and precious metals in Nevada that they're now realizing are there currently. And so that treaty was ratified, and it recognized boundaries. And those boundaries make up approximately 85 to 90% of the state of Nevada. And of that land base, approximately 87% is considered federally managed lands. Public lands for the most part, but parts of it where the Yucca Mountain facility is, where the Nevada test site is, those are Department of Energy and Department of Defense managed. So for the most part, the federal government is in control currently of Western Shoshone territory. And that has been the challenge at the international level. And so in some ways that's helped because we don't have a lot of conflict with private landowners. Our issues with the federal government, which out in rural Nevada, a lot of the ranchers agree with us because they don't like what the BLM is doing either. So in some ways, like I said, that's helped us gain some support. But in other ways, we're trying to negotiate with basically this invisible headless entity that seems to shift from DC to New York to wherever. So negotiations have been very difficult. We then took it when they said the Inter-American Commission wasn't binding on them because they're simply a member of the Organization of American States and they haven't fully ratified any treaty under the Inter-American system. There's a treaty, the Convention on the Rights and Duties of Man. The U.S. has not adopted that. They have simply become a member of the Organization of American States, and so the treaty body that are the law that we use was the Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, and they informed us that they don't think it's binding. So we took it to the UN, and we took it to a body called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The U.S. signed and ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, okay, back in the 1980s. And I guess the attorneys in the State Department that read this document didn't think that it had any implications besides those that the U.S. had already put in place with the civil rights movement. and the different federal laws that came out of the civil rights movement. What they didn't realize is that Indigenous people were going to look at that and say, you know what? We have rights to be free from racial discrimination as well. And I'll tell you what, at least from my experience as an attorney, I haven't seen any more racially based, antiquated, and I'm going to use the word genocide motivated doctrine than the doctrine of discovery. I mean, that says that because you're non-European and you're non-Christian, that you're less than other human beings. And if you look at some of the case law, I mean, the word savage, childlike, animal-like, beast, these are actually still in current case law in the United States of America and still applied against Indigenous peoples. And that is what has been coming out. And that's the way we wrote our briefs to the UN. We call it CERD for short, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The first review of the United States took place in 2002 was the first review of the United States. And the US, we were able to submit questions to the committee. And the committee members, 13 of the 18 committee members raised questions specifically on Native American and Indigenous rights in the United States. The US was not ready for it. They didn't think this was an issue. So their response to the question about what gives the United States the right to claim that they have plenary power over Indigenous peoples, that they have the right to unilaterally abrogate Indigenous lands and territories without just compensation, without free, prior, and informed consent. What gives you the right to think you can do that? They cited to Johnson versus McIntosh. They cited to this case that Professor Miller just informed you about, that's based on this so-called doctrine of discovery. The committee was appalled. Their response, and I was trying to remember the exact quote. I have it in some different things I've kept, but I didn't bring it with me. But it was something to the effect, this expert slammed his fist on the table and said, we are appalled that you would cite to this antiquated racist doctrine that has been rejected by the enlightened members of the international community, and that the US would continue to enforce this on the living victims of this doctrine. It was so, I had goosebumps, and we had this whole Shoshone delegation with us. This was over in Geneva, Switzerland. And it just made your hair stand on end, because for once, publicly, you see this exposed. And that's one thing that we've been talking about, because people say, and Tupac said one of the objectives is to look at, what do we do now? And I think bringing it here locally to state governments, it was interesting. I think it was Senator Jackson mentioned the Indian Commissioner, Representative Hale, one of our two esteemed hosts here today. And that was one of the topics we've been talking about. How about getting state governors to put in place advisory councils of elders? So in Nevada, we have Washoe, Paiute, and Shoshone. We have elders in each of those communities that know things about the land base in the current state of Nevada that could assist in government planning and land management, decision making, not just for the benefit of non-Indians, the benefit of Indigenous peoples, but for everyone in the state, and start to get those discussions and dialogues occurring and that level of respect. U.S. federal Indian law and policy, I think we have a longer road to haul there, because one of the responses that we've gotten in our case is people saying to us, well, if you guys win, what's going to happen? We're going to have this whole Pandora's box of Indian land claims. I had a minister from New Zealand tell me, well, if you guys are right, and if we do what the Indigenous people in New Zealand are asking for, and give them their ancestral land back, recognize their rights. I always say, Carrie Ann always corrects me, it's not giving back because they've never been taken, and I think Mr. Newcomb's gonna address that, but it's recognition, because they're still there. Those rights are still there. Those rights are inherent. No outside colonial body can take those rights away. They are there. So it's a recognition, not a getting back. So I could just hear Carrie correcting me. But this minister from New Zealand says, well, if you're right, then we have to recognize the entire country of New Zealand. And I'm thinking in my mind, good, I'm glad you realized that. And then he's, looking at me, terrified, and he says, what would they want us to do? All get on boats and leave? And he was serious. And this is, a diplomat at the United Nations. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, because I'm always trying to think of how do we move this forward? Instead of, slamming our faces up against a wall or each other, we all live here now. This is the state of this world that we live in now. How do we move forward in a positive way and try to address the redress from the history, but also move forward so we can address what's coming? And I was looking at him and I was thinking, well, gosh, you're blowing up bombs and you've been pretty horrible guests in this land, and I really have a hard time understanding why you don't think you should be put on boats and move. But I thought, how do I say this in a way that isn't just defensive? And I said, well, why don't you start by telling the truth? Why don't you start by admitting what's happened? And he just looked at me like this blank look. And I was talking to Raymond Yowell, who is the former chief of the Western Shoshone National Council, the traditional government in Shoshone territory. I was telling him the story, and he looks at me and he goes, well, Julie, they've never told the truth. He probably didn't know what you meant. And I thought, wow. So to me, that's one of the things, if we're talking about objectives, is, it was also one of our hosts that mentioned the Native American Caucus here. And the purpose is to provide a forum to educate. And so in many ways what we're doing is educating. And I think that's through our work with the Western Shoshone, I think that's what we've been able to do. Back in 2006, we got a full decision from this committee, the CERD committee. And it was a big deal. They had never issued a decision against the United States of America. And at the United Nations, the US, as everyone here probably knows, they carry quite a bit of clout. And so we started filing with them in 2000, and actually in 1998 we started filing with them. And so it took us up until 2006 to get that full decision. And now actually they're issuing decisions almost every one of their sessions, and they're referred to commonly as the Indigenous Committee, because this particular committee on the elimination of racial discrimination has taken particular notice of the doctrine of discovery and its impacts and the situation of Indigenous peoples around the world. But we got that decision, and that's when we came home to this announcement that the US was going to detonate this bomb called Divine Strike, which again, interestingly, divine, where does the word come? Christendom, domination, divine strike. So we were able to play on that, and in a lot of our press and media we played on that. And so we actually had non-Indian Christian ministers joining in radio programs with traditional grandmothers, Carrie Dan and others, to say, you know what, this has been happening to all of us and affects all of us, because if we're going to exert dominion over our natural resources and our territories and not think of the consequences, but think only that we have some God-given right as human beings to destroy, to take what we want and not think about the consequences, then that's an impact on all of us. And that's one of the things through our Shoshone case as an attorney, looking at how do we take traditional teachings and knowledge, and as Carrie's always said, it's a legal system. It's their laws. Their religion and spirituality and connections to the land are their laws. And one of the reasons that they have persisted in the struggle is because to give up and not to persist in the struggle, they would be in violation of their own spiritual teachings. And so, for example, when we say laws, LAWS, as my husband Larson noted at one of our UN Indigenous forums, L is land, A water, W, or A air, W water, and S is spirit or sun. Those are the traditional laws. Those are the four sacred things, that if any one of them is gone, then there is no life. And so that's been the basis of our work at the international level, and it's been very productive in terms of creating precedent, in terms of educating and bringing traditional teachings into this Euro legal system, but attempting to find some way to reform that, to get recognition and respect for these traditional systems. Most recently, we just got on March 9th, actually, of 2012, we got a communication back again from the UN Committee on the Elimination of of racial discrimination. If there are communities thinking about filing with this committee, they've been very quick to issue letters and correspondence to the governments in question. But I wanted to raise this here because they actually specifically mentioned the San Francisco Peaks issue as well. And I know that cultural and spiritual site issues and areas of concern have been a very large issue that they've been working with. But this correspondence went to the United States. It actually went to Betty King, who's the ambassador and permanent representative to the United States mission to the United Nations. And it raises the concerns about both the San Francisco Peaks area as well as the Western Shoshone situation, and calls upon the U.S. to sit down with leaders here on San Francisco Peaks issues, but also leaders in the Western Shoshone area, and discuss these. So I'm not sure if this is something that through the Arizona State Legislature, if they could use this in any way to help encourage those discussion or leadership from here. I think I really appreciate the relationship you have here with the Arizona State Legislature. I think that's something that we need to work on in Nevada as well. We're working on these things from an international level. Those of you that have any background, we all know we're right. What is being said here is the truth, and it needs to be brought out. It needs to be brought out in a way that can move it forward and benefit everyone, I think. So I'm not sure if my husband has anything to say. We have a couple of minutes, Larson. How'd I do on time?
Good, good.
I have to stand in front of a judge all the time, and so if I don't limit my time to exactly what they say, I'm like in trouble. Okay? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If you never met Carrie Dan, she's from the Western Shoshone. I remember she yelled at me one time. And she said, "You young warriors need to come over and help us. Us old ladies are breaking down these fences and standing up against these marshals. You guys need to come help us." And she put me in my place because she said, "You're a big guy. You should be out there." But we missed Carrie and our trips to Western Shoshone. So thank you, Julie, so much for coming, and Larson, Bill. I'm really glad that you guys are here, and we always have a good time and get more educated on the issues with Western Shoshone. How's everybody doing? Everybody okay? Pretty informative? Yeah? You want to be an Indian today? Good. The next speaker I want to introduce is probably for us, along with Professor Miller, is one of the foremost leading experts on the doctrine of discovery and its impact on indigenous peoples, not only in this hemisphere, but throughout the world. Steve Newcomb is one of the persons we call when we have issues. In fact, some years back, we sat down at the United Nations on, I believe it was the 3rd or 4th level of the building. Normally we don't get to go up there, but I think because we had Chief Orrin Lyons and a couple of heavy hitters, we were allowed to sit and speak with the Papal Nuncio, who is directly a representative, obviously, of the Vatican. And during that time, the Papal Nuncio had flanking his right and left two extremely intelligent young lawyers from Yale and I believe Harvard. And we brought up the topic, or the doctrine of discovery. And Steve continued to berate the lawyers about the history of doctrines of discovery, and they took notes because they themselves did not know much about it. But at that time, the Papal Nuncio said that they were void and that they were not in existence anymore. Again, Steve Newcomb argued about Johnson v. McIntosh and about other cases that have taken place, and still to this day, cases that impact indigenous peoples here in the United States and throughout the world. So I want to bring up Mr. Steve Newcomb one of the most renowned researchers on the doctrines of discovery. Steve? Go on.
Good morning. I want to pay my respects to the ancestors of this land, the O'odham people, and to acknowledge their traditional territory, and also to acknowledge the representatives of the state of Arizona, Representative Hale and Senator Jackson, and say I'm very happy to be here. Some of these subjects that I'll be talking about are a little bit challenging because they do go into the organic concepts, the originating concepts that had resulted in so much devastation for our nations and peoples. I'm actually Shawnee and Lenape. Our people, our nations are from back in the eastern seaboard area. And so it's interesting to look at how all these things have affected, these doctrines as they're called, these concepts, ideas have affected so many nations and peoples throughout the world. I want to mention that I think it's key and critical in terms of looking for solutions to honor and respect each and every one of the indigenous nations throughout this land, this continent, this hemisphere, and to speak in terms of the present day territories of our nations and peoples. For example, I work with the Sequan Band of the Kumeyaay Nation, the Kumeyaay people in the Kumeyaay territory, which is today commonly known as San Diego. But when I travel, people say, "Where do you live?" And I say, "I live in the Kumeyaay territory," now today commonly called San Diego. I make sure that I acknowledge that that is still existing, because thousands of years of relationship culturally and spiritually of a particular nation or people with their land and with all the elements of life within those ecosystems, with the waters and everything, that cannot be just negated or canceled out because some other people show up to a shoreline and plant their flag and their cross in the sand or in the land, and then make some proclamation in front of a notary and make it an official document to say that they have created rights of sovereignty in that place when they're from somewhere else. And so I want to make sure that I start out by acknowledging that. The other thing I want to mention is that what are these documents we're talking about in terms of the documents issued by the Holy See, what is now commonly understood as the Vatican? And why are those documents so important? When you look at the language of those documents, which I'll quote in a moment, you'll understand some of the reasons why they result in behavior that has been so destructive all throughout the world for indigenous nations and peoples. For example, a papal document issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Alfonso of Portugal in 1452, the Pope instructed or authorized the king to go to the western coast of Africa, and this is the direct quoted language, to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. And the instruction in the document is that they are to convert the land. Of course, they're to engage in religious conversion, but this is specifically to convert the land of the African peoples. And in that context, the word convert means to unlawfully or wrongfully appropriate that which belongs to another. And because that's the understanding of the word convert, in the very next sentence or the very next section of the document, the Pope declares the actions to be just and lawful. Those kinds of doctrines, that was in 1452, But in 1455, 56, 1481, 1514, other Portuguese-oriented papal documents were issued. But then in 1493, you also had the documents issued by Pope Alexander VI regarding the voyage of Cristobal Colon, otherwise known as Columbus. And in that document, you find some key phrases. And by the way, these documents are found in a book called European Treaties, bearing on the history of the United States and its dependencies to 1648, published by the Carnegie Institution in 1917. And you can find them in both Latin and English. And any of you very diligent students, I highly recommend that you look at the Latin, go deep into that Latin language, because that's the language of the Roman Empire. And it's a language system that explains so much of what's going wrong in the world today. But those papal documents from 1493, there are several of them. And there's one sentence in particular in Latin, and it states, sub dominio actuali temporali aliquorum dominorum Christianorum constitute non sint. And what that means in English is not under the domination of any Christian dominator. And so that dominorum Christianorum is a critically important concept because it's the idea of Christian domination, Christian dominator. There's another sentence in that document that says, we trust in him, with a capital H on him, from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed. And the word for dominations is translated into governments in English. So the singular word for government in that context is dominación in Latin. So these are very critical, important points and important concepts because they do explain why there are supposed to be checks and balances on government. In other words, the law, the rule of law, is not simply to be there for the people, quote unquote, but it's actually to hold checks on governmental officials and to hold them in check to curb their activities and their actions so that the deadly kind of lethal power that they have at their disposals is held in check by certain things such as a Bill of Rights and so forth. Now, when you trace these documents back, all forward rather, in history, what you'll find is that the papal documents, along with royal charters of England and many other kinds of charters, which were grants of rights to land and grants of presumed rights of dominion and so forth, you find the organic laws, the source of the organic laws of the United States. And so, for example, before I came here, I thought I should look into how these doctrines of discovery and domination relate to the history of Arizona. So I looked in a book called Federal and State Constitutions, Colonial Charters, and Other Organic Laws of the United States, published in 1877 by the United States Senate and the U.S. Government Printing Office. And what I found is that what gave birth to the territory of New Mexico was an agreement between the Republic of Texas and the United States. And then that Organic Act of New Mexico, the Territorial Act of New Mexico, gave birth to the Organic Act of Arizona. And that resulted in the territory of Arizona. But I still wasn't finding in those two documents anything that seemed particularly relevant. And so what I did was I looked more closely at the language on Texas. But in order to do that, I'm using Google Books. So I go back to the table of contents under Texas, and what I look at there is that it says, right under Texas, it says Spanish claims of dominion in the Americas. And then I go back to the book and look under Texas, I'm not finding it. So I have to look more carefully at the table of contents. And then I see it refers me actually to a much earlier part of the book, pages 304 and 305. So I go back to those pages, and that refers me to Florida. And interestingly enough, the organic documents, the originating documents for Florida, given in this book published by the United States Senate, pardon me, are two different documents. One, the royal prerogatives granted to Columbus in 1492, and the second document is the papal bull of 1493 issued by Pope Alexander VI to the monarchs of Spain. And that's the very document in which we find the very troubling concepts about domination and so forth. So that means that there's a direct linkage to the organic documents of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and as a matter of fact, also to California and Utah and Idaho and Colorado, and they all go back, trace back to the Spanish Crown Law and to these other documents. Interestingly enough, in the Constitution of the Republic of Mexico in 1824, there's actually a section under the Supreme Court of Justice, as it's called, to make sure that the court is cognizant of the pontifical bulls, briefs, and rescripts in all matters litigant. So in other words, they're to actually reference the papal bulls as part of their judicial oversight in looking at that's within the scope of their work, in other words. So these are fascinating ways in which all of these ideas give rise to patterns of behavior and claims of territory and dominion on the part of the United States government and various state governments, to the detriment of indigenous nations and peoples. In Johnson versus McIntosh, there's a key line that tells you how this all works to carry it through. And this is from Chief Justice John Marshall in Johnson v. McIntosh. While the different nations of Europe respected the right of the natives as occupants, they asserted the ultimate dominion to be in themselves, and claimed and exercised as a consequence of this ultimate dominion a power to convey the soil while yet in the possession of the natives. So if you parse that, you pull it apart and you delve deeply into it, it's the idea that they have, just by showing up, they have somehow inherent within themselves this right of Christian domination or Christian dominion, as it's euphemistically called, and that the Indians, the heathen original nations and peoples, actually have merely a right of heathen occupancy. And so that terminology is used throughout. Now in 1954, there was a case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court called Tehitan Indians versus United States. And the United States government created a legal brief for that case, and I'm going to quote a couple of lines from that because I think it's critical and it links to what Julie Fischel and Professor Miller have presented on the doctrine of discovery. And under the category, under the heading of argument, the United States government wrote this. Quote, prior to the great era of discovery, beginning in the latter part of the 15th century, the Christian nations of Europe acquired jurisdiction over newly discovered lands by virtue of grants from the popes, who claimed the power to grant to Christian monarchs the right to acquire territory in the possession of heathens and infidels. Now that's direct language from the United States government to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954. And it continues. For example, in 1344, Clement VI had granted the Canary Islands to Louis of Spain. And following the discovery of the New World by Columbus, Alexander VI in 1493 issued bulls granting to Spain all lands under Christian rule. It was necessary for the civilized Christian nations of Europe to develop a new principle which all could acknowledge as the law by which they should regulate, as between themselves, the right of acquisition of territory in the New World, which they had found to be inhabited by Indians, who were heathens and uncivilized according to European standards, unquote. So they're using the exact framework that we're talking about here today in their method of argumentation, and the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the United States position in that case. And when you look at the Tehitan decision, you will not find language specific to Christians in their ruling. They do talk about the idea of the idea of Indian title being by permission of the whites to occupy the land. But what the Supreme Court did do in its ruling is cite to Henry Wheaton's Elements of International Law, published in 1836. And I'll just read you a very brief section of that. It says, according to the European ideas of that age, the heathen nations of the other quarters of the globe were the lawful spoil and prey of their civilized conquerors. And as between the European powers themselves, the sovereign pontiff was the supreme arbiter of conflicting claims. Thus the bull of Pope Alexander VI reserved from the grant to Spain all lands which had been previously occupied by any other Christian nation, and the patent granted to Henry VII of England to John Cabot and his sons authorized them to, quote, seek out, discover, and find all isles and regions and provinces whatsoever that may belong to heathens and infidels, and to subdue, occupy, and possess these territories as his vassals and lieutenants. It thus became a maxim of policy and of law that the right of the native Indians was subordinate to that of the first Christian discoverer. And so that is actually what the Supreme Court cited to in its decision Tehitan. When you start to look these concepts up, so for example, conquest, conqueror, and so forth, conquer, and subordinate, all these types of terms, there's actually a structure that's been identified by an amazing international law professor named Anthony Angie, and he has published a book called Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law. And in the foreword to that book, written by James Crawford, a very eminent international law professor, he mentions that there is a structure of domination and subordination that Professor Angie has identified in international law. And what I've begun to understand is that there's a specific vocabulary of dominance or a vocabulary of domination that has been used repeatedly throughout all these various cases and continue to be used today. And that once we identify that vocabulary, we're then able to decode and understand exactly how that system is operating today. So I think this is critically important because the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is going to take up the theme for this year's upcoming Permanent Forum from May 7th to May 18th is the continuing impacts of the doctrine of discovery on indigenous peoples, but also redress for past conquests, which when the Tanya Ganella Frischner submitted a paper called the Preliminary Study on the Doctrine of Discovery to the Permanent Forum in 2010, that was not stated in there, nothing about conquest, only about dominance and so forth, the framework of dominance that was clearly identified in that paper. So what I see is that there's this effort to try to reframe what we're calling attention to in terms of conquest, because conquest has a legitimacy under international law. And you could say that's over and done with, you're conquered, that's the way it goes. But domination does not have legitimacy under international law. And at least there's no doctrine whereby you could point to and say, yeah, that's considered acceptable. And so what we're pointing out is that domination results in massive destruction. It results in the suicides in our various communities and among our nations. It results in the destruction of waters. And it results in so much that's very problematic that needs to be dealt with and addressed. So what I see is that the non-Indian society has actually deprived itself tremendously by dehumanizing and subhumanizing indigenous peoples. They have deprived themselves of being able to learn from the vast amount of knowledge and wisdom that indigenous nations and peoples have been able to accumulate over thousands and thousands of years, going back to the beginning of time as expressed in our oral histories. And so that's what needs to occur. Once this understanding of respect for the original laws of the land, for the original nations and peoples of the land, once that begins to occur, then there's going to be more of a flow of communication, and that knowledge that's been buried and suppressed is going to rise up. And if you want a clear understanding of what that knowledge and wisdom entails, look at the book called 1491 by Charles C. Mann. It's an amazing exploration, or so to speak, or an amazing understanding of just how incredibly wonderful and rich and vibrant and intelligent indigenous nations and peoples and their cultures and spiritual traditions have been and continue to be at this time. So the reason why there is language such as Shannon talked about, the autumn uprising, is because there's a word, that term uprising, you're down and you're rising up. The reason for that is because of a Latin term called deprimantur. Deprimantur means to push down, press down, weigh down, oppress, like to hold down. And so when the people are trying to reverse that, they're trying to come up. And that pushing down is the dehumanization, subhumanization process. So I won't go much longer. There may have been some other things I was thinking of talking about, but basically that covers the main gist of what I want to say today. And I really appreciate your time and attention. I will mention one other thing, and I'm glad I remembered it, because there's a term in English. You know, the dictionary is a wonderful tool for all of you students in the room, and anyone else for that matter. I've used dictionaries, and very old dictionaries, in my work for many decades now, and I'm always finding new things that I never understood before that should be very obvious, but they're not. For example, the word civilization. I recently was looking up that word, and it just jumped out at me. Maybe because I'm looking at it now with so much kind of a different perspective from so many years of research, but it hit me because it said the act of civilizing, especially the forcing of a particular cultural pattern on a population to whom it is foreign. The forcing of a particular cultural pattern on a population to whom it is foreign. When you impose or force another cultural pattern on a people, and especially if that cultural pattern happens to be one of domination, well, the forcing itself is also part of that domination. So when they say uncivilized, they're really talking about undominated, those who have not yet been subjected to that process of domination and assimilation. So the healing that is critically important, the revitalization that's critically important, involves coming to a deeper level of understanding for ourselves that we're not conquered. It's not a conquest that they've accomplished and achieved, and that's just the state of things. It's very important to understand that word is. Four very key words in English are supposedly, purportedly, so-called, and allegedly. Because when we're looking at Supreme Court rulings, there's the tendency to say, well, it is this way because Supreme Court such and such says this, that, and the other. And I don't do that. I say they allege that it's that case, or they're purporting or deeming something. It's these concepts. The greatest way to think outside of the box is to realize it's not even a box. It's an idea about a box. And these are concepts and ideas that we have a perfect right as the original free and independent nations and peoples of this land to fully expose, to shed the light of understanding upon them so that we can come to a better understanding and appreciation of each other as human beings who have a sacred role to live in right relationship with the original laws of the land, air, water, sun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. It's always educational to sit down with Steve, and he uses these words. I sometimes have to tell him, Steve, I'm just a layman Indian. Don't you scare me with these large words. But really, his wisdom, his knowledge is profound, and these discussions are very important. We're going to start wrapping up here in a few minutes, but I just wanted to remind you that this is streaming live, and it is. We are already getting some remarks from California and New Mexico. So I believe that this might be the first ever forum in a state capital on the doctrine of discovery. As far as my recollection may go, and I don't know, maybe we could find out, but the next couple of speakers I want to ask, and they are going to come up together, is Monica Carrasco. She is the community liaison to the Alianza Sin Fronteras. She is the coordinator for the Alliance Without Borders. And I also want to introduce to you someone who I've known for not too long now, but he is a council member of the town of Guadalupe, which is a Yaqui Yoeme community. And as you know, Arizona has been in the forefront of some of the toughest immigration policies in recent years. And with SB 1070 and now the concern with the ethnic studies ban, the Mexican American community and the indigenous peoples, specifically the Yaqui, the Yoeme, have been impacted here by the arrest and the scare tactics of some of the local policing authorities. So I want to ask Monica to come up and to give us a brief overview of how the Yaqui community is handling some of these issues down in the border, and then we'll ask council member to come up. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me here. Thank you to Tonatierra and all the organizers of this event. I would like to convey hello from the director of the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders, Jose Matus. He was not able to join us today. He needed to take care of his health, and he sends his blessings and for this to be a successful event. Quickly to let you know about our work, our mission is to affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples, their rights to self-determination, their collective and civil rights, and the rights of sovereignty, and the protection of sacred sites, and the free restricted movement across international borders. The Indigenous Alliance started in 1997 with a group of tribal nations, grassroots organizations, concerned individuals who saw the need to come together to fight against the injustice of the border. The border being a manifestation of what the doctrine has become. It's one of the manifestations of how historically the doctrine continues to affect us. And the border is one of those manifestations that's the most present in our time and the most concrete at this moment. Since 1990, Indigenous peoples of the southern border have experienced many obstacles that continue to impede tribal members to conduct cross-border cultural, religious, and family business visits. This limits our sovereign rights, our self-determination, and the passage of various anti-immigration legislation and border enforcement policies also violates our human rights. So when we're talking about these issues, we're not just talking about it for the Yaquis We're talking about it for the Kumeyaay that Professor Nuka mentioned. We're talking about it for the Kickapoo, the Tohono O'odham, the Pai Pai, just to name a few. We're talking about all tribal nations that are affected by the border. Another thing that we need to look at, and when I say border, I mean California, Arizona, Texas, all of us. Capital goods and services have more rights to cross the border than people do. And last time I checked, goods, capital, and services aren't at the brink of being extinct like our languages are, our spiritual ways, and our culture. Yet that has more rights than we do. Professor Nuka mentioned that this is important because we're missing what Indigenous people can bring to the table, their history, that legacy, that beauty of the world. And again, capital services and all of that has more rights than we do. Other manifestations of the doctrine of discovery could be seen then as NAFTA, CAFTA, those very tools that make it easier for other things to cross border or to exploit people and the environment. The other issue about the border is that we don't see very often is that it is an environment. It is a part of Mother Earth. There are sacred sites there, there are endangered animals, there are places that need to be protected. And instead of being protected, it's a war zone where it's become militarized and it's under constant attack. So it is our plan to continue our work that people over profits, Mother Earth over profits. So with that, I'd actually like to invite someone else up to the podium, someone that came very far, who's also been affected by Vicky. Si puede pasar, por favor. Usted, sí. Sí. Vicky came very far from Mexico to join us. Y no sé si usted gusta dar un mensaje. She lives right there and deals with a lot of these issues. Usted ha visto estos problemas en vida, ¿verdad? She has lived these problems. She lives by the border and she knows. So, si usted gusta dar un mensaje. Yo le traduzco. I will translate.
Bueno, buenos días.
Good morning
a todos.
to everyone.
Primero quiero presentarme. Yo soy Oda
I am Ota
de Durango, México.
from Durango, Mexico.
A mí se me ha preguntado muchas veces, bueno, ¿qué quiere decir Oda?
I've been asked many times what does Ota mean?
Y yo digo, ser humano. Yo soy un ser humano.
And all I have to say is that I am a
Y me
human.
dio en especial hoy mucho gusto saber que mis hermanos Odam de aquí de Phoenix también tienen el mismo concepto.
And
¿Qué es Odam? Un ser humano. Eso es lo que somos, seres humanos. Y nos debieran tratar como seres humanos. Allá en Durango se nos conoce como tepehuanos. A nosotros. Tepehuano es una palabra náhuatl.
In Durango, we are known as ¿cómo?
Tepehuano.
Tepehuanos. You don't need to. If you'd like to. Okay. Tupac would like to do the translation.
Entonces, soy Oda y por lo tanto me voy a expresar, si ustedes me lo permiten, en Oda. Shivan Gorwish. Iñado Nyodam. Yakam Phoenix. Anir Odam Koreanka. Anja mo puisiam tudam apim na pimia inke. Nais bai tutada. napim idam kam to aga ach odam wiskap na hu sir oingam anhit bain chat iam kita chung tanoi dai odam ach map to aga adil it nachas choida kogoj bai tuta da nam hai dit idam kamok to agada nam sit paluinda nachwaat nachir odam hit bai tu ikait ta chavgo luis. Yo lo que he expresado aquí
What I have said to you now
en mi lengua Odam,
in my Adam language,
que quiero agradecer en primer lugar a mi hermano Tupac
I'm grateful
y a mis hermanos Odam
to my brothers of Adam
por la invitación
for the
para que
invitation
yo hoy esté aquí con ustedes.
to be here with you today.
Y lo que ya explicaba,
What I explained,
que soy Odam
I'm Odam
del estado de Durango,
from the state of Durango, Mexico.
porque han de saber que hay Odam en Chihuahua,
But there are also Adam in Chihuahua,
hay Odam pocos en Nayarit,
a few in Nayarit
y también sé que hay Odam en Sonora.
and Sonora.
Y últimamente sé, lo cual me da mucho gusto,
But now,
que hay Odam aquí en Phoenix.
and I know there's Adam here too.
Hemos reconocido que tenemos un origen
We have understood now that we have an origin
Odam,
as
una
Adam,
lengua Odam,
a language that is
que es la
Adam,
que nos une y nos identifica.
that identifies us and holds us
Yo me
together.
sentí
I feel
identificada con este símbolo, con esta vara que está allí.
I identify with
Entre
these,
los Odam, allá en Durango,
with our people in Durango.
esto significa autoridad.
This is the significance of
Es
the
un
authority.
elemento que nos identifica.
It is the instrument
a
of
los Odam.
our identity as Adam.
En Durango, según datos oficiales,
Officially, the statistics,
somos aproximadamente 26,000 Odam,
26,000 Adam,
¿sí?, distribuidos en 2 municipios,
12 municipalities,
en 6 comunidades,
6 communities.
cada una de esas comunidades con su territorio definido.
Each one has a defined territory.
Y yo soy parte de una de ellas,
I
que
am
es Santa María de Ocotán,
Santa María de Ocotán,
que es considerada como la comunidad con mayor territorio
It is
a nivel nacional.
the largest extension of indigenous territory at the national level of Mexico.
Tenemos como 421,000 hectáreas en esa comunidad de donde yo formo parte.
421,000 hectares of land.
Hoy
Today,
estoy muy contenta de estar en este lugar.
I am happy to be here,
En este lugar donde se debaten ideas,
where ideas
planteamientos,
are debated, where thoughts are shared.
pero ojalá que me hubiera gustado que aquí estuvieran quienes tienen autoridad
But
para
I wish
debatir también
also
estos
that
temas.
those who have the responsibility, authority here, that they would have been here too also to listen.
El tema de los pueblos indígenas
The theme of the indigenous peoples
aquí en México, en Perú, en
in
Bolivia
Mexico, here in Peru and
y
Bolivia,
en todo el
in the
mundo
whole world,
ha sido un asunto
It's an
de
issue.
interés
issue
para
of interest
políticos,
for the
para
politicians,
académicos,
for the
para
academics, for the
historiadores,
historians,
y eso es importante,
and this is important.
¿sí? Pero más importante,
most
igual
important,
considero yo,
What I believe,
que estos temas
that these issues, these themes,
sean abordados por nosotros,
that they be elaborated by
Los
we ourselves,
indígenas.
the indigenous peoples.
¿sí?,
Yes,
para definir
to
nuestro
define
rumbo,
our road, our path,
para hablar de nuestras experiencias de vida,
to weave our experiences together,
para hablar de nuestro sentir
to speak of our feeling
como pueblo y como seres humanos.
as pueblos, as nations, and as human beings.
Sabemos que de fuera
From outside,
se nos trata, como ya bien lo decía,
as was said, the way
se
we
nos
are treated,
han dado conceptos
they have put concepts on us,
diversos,
indirectly.
como salvajes,
Savages, we
como
have been
gente
called.
sin razón,
People without culture.
como ignorantes,
Ignorance.
¿sí? Se nos ha marginado,
We've been marginalized.
se nos ha excluido,
We've been excluded.
se nos han impuesto
They have imposed
ideas,
upon us ideas.
religiones, lenguas.
Languages, religions.
Por eso considero
And
que es
for this now, this is
importante
important,
que nosotros
that we
abordemos también
elaborate
estos asuntos
these issues.
y hagamos
And we shall make
que
it,
nuestra voz sea
that our
escuchada,
voice be heard,
que nuestras ideas sean conocidas,
that our ideas will be known,
sí, y se nos deje de considerar
and that will be not considered,
como todo lo que ya se dijo aquí
What was
y
already
otras
said.
muchas.
that we will not be diminished.
Ha habido a través de todos los tiempos
Throughout the times of all times,
diferentes acciones
there are different factions,
a favor a veces de los pueblos
sometimes on our
y
favor,
muchas veces en contra de los
but mostly
pueblos.
against us.
¿Sí? En México,
In Mexico,
a mí me ha tocado
I've seen this, I've lived
vivir
it.
políticas como la castellanización,
the imposition of the Castilian Spanish language.
¿sí? El objetivo era castellanizar sin importar
To Hispanicize us, to
Sí.
Latinoize us.
la presencia de tantas lenguas. Y en este
And
momento
in this moment,
hay más de 62 lenguas que se
72
hablan en
languages,
México.
the indigenous language alive in Mexico
A
still.
pesar de eso,
Yet,
la política era
the
el
politicians
exterminio de las
to
lenguas.
exterminate us,
Pero creo que
to exterminate our languages. But now the most important,
pero lo más importante es que a pesar de todas esas
No.
políticas, de
In
esas
spite of it.
estrategias,
In spite of
de
that.
esas acciones, aquí estamos
we are
los
here
indígenas,
still,
buscando siempre
looking, searching
avanzar,
to continue forward,
¿sí? A ser escuchado,
to be heard,
a que se respete nuestro derecho,
to
nuestros
respect our
derechos
rights,
humanos,
our human rights,
nuestro derecho a una cultura,
the rights of our culture,
nuestro derecho a una lengua,
to our language,
nuestro derecho a tener
a right
un espacio,
to be our own home.
porque sabemos,
We know,
y esa es historia que se comparte con todos,
and this is the history that's shared everywhere,
que hemos sido movidos,
that we have
que se
moved.
nos ha excluido del lugar
We've been
que
excluded
originalmente
from our original
habitábamos.
lands.
Y creo que eso
And this
no
now,
solo es algo que vivimos los Odam
this isn't just our
en
experience
Durango,
with Otham in Durango.
ese es algo que han vivido todos los pueblos
All of the peoples have gone through this
en todo el mundo.
and throughout the world.
Y me da entonces mucho gusto saber
And
que
it is
en
good, I
este
know.
espacio hoy
Today in this place,
estamos compartiendo
We have
diferentes
sharing
experiencias, diferentes
our
puntos de
different
vista
experiences and perspectives
en relación
in relation
a los pueblos
to our
indígenas.
indigenous peoples.
Y yo quiero decirles a mis hermanos
I would
Oda
say to my Otham brothers,
que ojalá que nos demos la oportunidad
hopefully we can have more
de tener
opportunity
un reencuentro,
to
los
come
Oda
together as Otham
de Durango,
from
de
Durango,
Chihuahua,
Chihuahua,
Sonora
Sonora,
y los de aquí,
and you from here,
para hablar
To speak
sobre nuestros
about
asuntos,
what we need to speak about
sobre nuestra cultura,
our culture,
sobre lo que somos como pueblo,
who we are, what we are as
sobre
peoples,
nuestro origen,
from our origin.
pues considero que tenemos un
We
origen
have the origin,
igual.
the same,
Tenemos, hasta ahorita nos damos cuenta que tenemos una lengua,
and we have our language.
¿sí? que por situaciones que desconocemos
Because of
hemos
situations
tenido
that we don't
diferentes distintos y nos encontramos ahorita
we
en
were
diferentes
isolated from each other, but we are
ámbitos, diferentes
once again
contextos,
in this context,
diferente tierra,
in different lands.
pero
But
hay algo que nos une,
there's something that is
que es
pulling us
nuestra
together.
creencia
This
hacia,
belief,
hacia lo más grande.
something
Como
greater.
para nosotros
For
Odam
us.
es el Ichat,
Each up,
el Dios,
what is God,
ese que dirige
the
todo.
origin, everything.
Y ojalá que sea pronto este reencuentro.
And I hope to see this happen soon.
El lugar, bueno, seguramente se puede definir.
It will
Puede
be
ser en
defined.
México, puede ser
Maybe
aquí.
in Mexico, maybe
Esa
here.
sería mi propuesta.
This is what I propose.
Yo la dejo ahí.
And I put it to you.
Y para todos ustedes,
And all of you,
pues muchas gracias
many thank you
por haberme escuchado.
to listen to me. That's it.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Sanchez. I'm a council member to the town of Guadalupe. Also a advocate and a activist here in the community. I've done a lot of work with a lot of members here in this floor today. But today I come here talking about border issues. Now, I know the town is pretty far from the border, but given my heritage of being a Native American to the Pascuayaqui tribe and the Tohono O'odham tribe, I can speak to experience, at least to what my members of the family have said, religious individuals in our culture have stated in the past about the border. So I'm going to talk about two different tribes, the Pascuayaqui tribe and the Tohono O'odham tribe. I am not here actually in representation of these tribes, but of the people that I know, as well as my family and myself, have experiences in these issues. The Pascuayaqui tribe is actually Benjamo in Scottsdale, Guadalupe, about half the members in the town of Guadalupe are Yaqui, and Hightown that is located, I think it's in Chandler, and also Pascuayaqui tribe, the old and the new, that is in Tucson. We also have Vicam, the Rio Yaqui, which a lot of the towns and cities that are on the Rio Yaqui are all Yueme. Some of the issues that pertain to the Yaquis in the border issues is the passports. Currently, right now, the tribe has issues and members also bringing ceremonial people down to Guadalupe as well as, the old Pascua to do the ceremonies. So a lot of the times is the passports, getting through the federal government and getting all these passports done. I know they went through a very long, drawn-out process just to get this done because of the laws that they placed trying to keep people from coming into the country without paperwork. So now they have this passport. Also family. There's family in Mexico and family in the United States. Constantly get divided because of the border due to immigration, deportation, and also just the locks that they have. Religion, obviously the ceremonial. The ceremonies always get affected because there's always money in that. And having to get ceremonial people down to Guadalupe, as far as Guadalupe, try to get all these things done. So these passports sometimes don't do their justice. They also affect indigenous cultures. The Tohono O'odham tribe, I know they're currently still working on the passport. As a matter of fact, the tribe is actually divided in half. One half is in the United States, the other half is in Mexico. So a quick division right there. So this talk about the fence would greatly, divide this community. And that's where a lot of my family resides down in Sells. But although I know that many of them live where our last speaker lived, I mean, this would just cause a big wall. It's like putting a wall in the middle of your house. You can't talk to half of your family. And then also, my brother, going down there as well, for family events, as well as most recently, like when I was 16, went down to my mother's funeral. A military war zone. It looks like a military war zone. It does not look like a community. It looks like a community inhabited by Border Patrol, because that's all you see. I mean, you might see one tribal police, but you'll see probably 10 Border Patrols before you get to this town, as you enter the reservation, or before you leave it. So, I mean, this looks really bad, and unfortunately, I haven't had the experience of living there, but I'll talk more about an experience that I did have. So, the experience that I'm going to talk to you about, I'm not advertising the movie, but if you guys have not seen it, I encourage you guys to see it and then try to experience what I did. The movie In Time, where it's a border movie. It's a poverty, stricken place that you survive only on time, and you have to work for that time. Well, this is the story that I had to go down to visit a family member that was recently deported down to Mexico, also tribal member. So when I went down to visit my family member in Mexico, I dropped off my aunt in San Diego so they can spend some time, and I decided to drive down to Tijuana, only because ATMs are really scarce around that place, so I have no money, and I got paid right at midnight. So I drove down to Tijuana, and the experience that I had driving down there reminded me of this movie. See, I wasn't thinking about the movie until I experienced driving to Tijuana, from San Luis to Tijuana, which is just on the other side of the border of the United States border. As you're driving down there, you have a lot of checkpoints, military checkpoints, pay tolls. As a matter of fact, one time I got to a pay toll I could not pass because I did not have money. And because they're so strict there, they will not let you pass. So it just brings back to, this thing with money, corporations, the military, this whole drug issue that constantly gets put into the whole indigenous issue. I always joke with people that the only difference between Mexicano, Latino, Hispanic, and a Native American is the border. It didn't matter if you were Native American. Pretty much everyone that is of this tone color, and I've seen lighter, are indigenous. And it's unfortunate that we have these laws, these borders, these passports, these safeguards to supposedly keep the wealth in the United States away from many of the impoverished, like I said, third world countries, and Mexico could be considered that, away. As I was driving down that border, you can see the border I'm driving on, Mexico. You see the border, then you see on the other side it's complete, like the nature has been kept. But on this side, it's like falling apart. And then you're driving by houses that are very run down. Yet on the other side, you have all this wealth. And what's keeping it? It's this border, it's this checkpoint. It's all this military influx. So, again, I just thank you guys for sharing my point of view. Again, we have a lot of issues in the town of Guadalupe. It's more like Sheriff Joe Arpaio, SB 1070 287G. But the border has a lot of issues too. It revolves around indigenous issues, and it affects as far north as Guadalupe. So thank you guys.
Before we close here, I want to make a couple of announcements. And then I would like Gustavo to say a couple of words from the table there. He's going to turn on his microphone. They're going to turn it on for him. I would have him come up here, but it'll take him 30 minutes to get up here. That's all right, I can tease him. He's one of my also other uncles. So, but just to let you know, after this forum, we will be convening again at Tonatierra, which is on 7th Street in McKinley. We'll be having lunch there. Lunch is being provided on behalf of the women and the organization of Tonatierra. So we want everyone to go there and to have lunch. We will also have a working group on a plan of action. So we're asking and encouraging you to come to share your thoughts, your concerns, and recommendations to today's forum. So if I can, Gustavo, you have the floor for a couple of minutes. I appreciate it. Oh, he's coming. Sorry. Okay, it won't take that long. Thank you.
Pastor Kamati. First of all, I want to ask Spirit from the four sacred directions to let me speak. Give me permission to speak. Secondly, I want to say good morning to each and every one of you. And it's really an honor to be here before you. It's really an honor to be. I never believed that I would be inside this legislation. I have been coming here for many years, but out in the front, demonstrating against the injustice that have passed in this legislation. In 1972, there was a very repressive law passed against agricultural workers, and at that time, I was working for Cesar Chavez, organizing farm workers here in the state of Arizona, because I was born here. I was born in Chandler back in 1932, and I come from a migrant farm worker background. I have been, but one of the things that they have asked me to do was to ask all the Mexicanos and the Chicanos and the Chichimecas to stand up while I speak, but I don't know the reason why. But if you want to, you can do it. Monday. Okay. Anyway, God darn it, I lost my thought. Because when I came here in the 60s, when I was having strikes up on the western part of the valley because of the treatment of agricultural workers. We didn't have no bathrooms, we didn't have no drinking water, we didn't have nothing. And who was out there? It wasn't just Mexicanos and Chicanos, but it was Tohono O'odham, Navajo people that used to come to work at this ranch. Over 300 families of Navajos. And one of the persons that came to help me organize the agricultural workers, the Navajos, was Ben Henley, one of the first elected officials from the Navajo Nation. So, you know, you have a long track and a long history of doing this, working for this injustice. So it's why it isn't the first time, and it won't be the last time that we will come here, because of all this psychological mind warfare that this legislation is playing on us. And I'm not talking about when they passed all these repressive laws like 1070. It wasn't because they felt, you know, they felt that it was a form of harassment so that we would leave the state, so that the Mexicanos and Chicanos and O'odhams from Mexico and the Cocopas from Mexico and all these other nations and the Opatas from Mexico and the Lipan Apache from Mexico would leave this country. But they have all the right to be here. They have all the right because we're from this hemisphere. We have been here since time immemorial. And we have been traversing this continent since time immemorial, from Alaska all the way to Tierra del Fuego. It isn't something new. This isn't a new phenomena, this migration of indigenous people from one end of this hemisphere to the other end. And that's why I'm so glad to see you here, because I feel when my brother here, Steve Newcomb, came out with the the Doctrine of Discovery, and he put it out at the United Nations. Man, that's changed my whole point of view of how to look at things. I made over 300 copies of that and gave it all over, so that I felt that that should be taught in the schools, that all Indian children, not just the Indian children, but the European Americans, the Asiatic Americans, the African Americans should know this Doctrine of Discovery, should know about this law that was passed to help us, the indigenous people, in 2007. And it should be part of the curriculum in the schools. Not what this legislation is trying to do, like Tom Horn and Hump and Tell, trying to erase ethnic studies, banning books like they did in Nazi Germany. That's what they done. Ban books. The Long Range Entente was banned. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was banned. All those books that teach you, where is that whole idea of learning? We don't have a Western mentality concept of intellect. We have our property that we own, our own people. We have our leaders, we have our intellectuals, but nothing is ever mentioned about them. Nothing. Only about Socrates or somebody back in Europe, but nothing about our own people. We need that. And we, as indigenous people, should force this legislation and any legislation that tries to eliminate our studies, our intellectuals, so they can be taught in the schools. That's why I believe when they say university, it means universal, that you take everything. Not these business schools that are being built now. Not these business schools where all they teach you how to be greedy, how to make money. No, we need poetry. When a Mexica warrior was formed, he not only learned how to fight, but he had to learn poetry, he had to learn how to animal husbandry, he had to learn all those things. And the schools were part of the curriculum in the Mexica country. And that was part of our education. And as the Europeans came and they eliminated and they imposed their mentality that they picked up in the West, no. If we allow this, those of us that are in school boards, those of us that are in the legislation, if we allow these people to continue to just impose their concepts and their ideas, then we're wrong. We are not doing our duty. When somebody comes to interview me and they say to me, well, what do you think of the Latino and the Hispanic world? What do you think about them? I said, the moment that you call me a Latino or you call me an Hispanic, I'm not going to give you no interview. You can call me a Mexica, you can call me an Indian, you can call me a Chicano, but you cannot call me a Latino or Hispanic because I'm neither of them. I wasn't born in Spain. I didn't come from Spain. My ancestry is Hopata. That's my ancestry from my mother's side. I don't know my father's side, but I do know my mother's side. And who am I going to believe? Am I going to believe the government? Or am I going to believe my mother? And they say that we don't exist, that the Opatas don't exist, but every time I go to Sonora and I make out these bulletin boards and I said, en busca de Opatas, in search of Opatas, people come up to me and say, yo soy Opata, yo soy Opata, yo soy Opata, yo soy Opata. So, our people and our children are going to learn by osmosis. They got to learn because we got to talk to them. like in the old days when they had the storytelling in the winter times. We got to do that. We got to talk to them. We cannot allow the television to become our babysitter. We cannot allow that. I want to thank you for your patience. I want to thank you for listening to me. And sí se puede. Thank you, señor. That's all right, nephew.
I like to hear the stories from Gustavo about Cesar Chavez and the impact that they had on the policies and changes against migrant workers. It's always good to hear. Well, we have come to the conclusion of today's forum, and it's been a beautiful morning, no? A lot of knowledge, a lot of education, a lot of inspiring words from indigenous peoples. Julie says she's not indigenous to these territories, but to me, she's been adopted by our clans. So I want to thank her. I want to thank Professor Miller for coming and shedding light. I want to thank Mr. Steve Newcomb for coming. Thank you very much. I want to thank Larson Bill for coming also. There's a couple of people before we leave that I want to recognize in the audience. Mr. Simon Ortiz, renowned poet and member. Mr. Simon Ortiz is one of the, he's always with us. He's always advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples. Also want to acknowledge Dr. James Wrightingham. Stand up, please. He's a professor at ASU, and he teaches on indigenous issues. Is there, I believe that's it that I can see. And I also want to acknowledge those children that are back there, the ones that came and ones that came in and left. They heard just a little bit. And it is important that we teach our children, because I think that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and it needs to bend toward more justice amongst indigenous or toward indigenous peoples. You have to be engaged. If you want to change things, you have to be engaged. If you want to recognize the rights of other peoples, specifically today indigenous peoples, you have to be engaged on the battle against human rights. You have to be engaged because we have the hope, we have the desire to change things. Indigenous peoples are the peoples who changed the world. Our life today, the reason we exist, is because of our cultures and our traditions and our steadfast relationship between us and our ancestors. You all have to agree that today has been very moving and very telling. It is emotional. It is difficult at times to hear these stories. When I think about the mass slaughter and extermination of indigenous peoples, it angers me. I'm sure it angers many of you. But it angers me because there are times I want my people to stand up and all come together and fight. But because of a forced assimilation and relocation, that seems difficult today. For many years we've come together and we have talked about and spoken about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And for 30 years the UN has debated, argued, met behind closed doors, with member states of the UN. Today, the United States President Obama said that he would, quote, lend his support, but they have not fully endorsed it. Why not? So we call on that administration to fully endorse the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We tell them that we are human beings and we have rights to our lands, to our territories, and to our natural resources. We know that the Declaration is not a savior for all indigenous peoples, but it is a start. It is a start. Federal Indian laws and policies still stifle us. They still restrict us. The last thing I want to touch on is the issue of sacred sites. To the south of you here is a place called Moadog. You guys know it as, if you live here, South Mountain. To the north of us is a new mountain that they named Payastuwa Peak. The mountain isn't new. The peak isn't new. But to us in autumn, it is Vainam Dwa, Iron Mountain. To the further south of us is another place they call Babakirdi, a sacred place to the autumn people. All of these sacred sites have our stories, they have our understanding of where we come from, our origins, and our relationship to Natagam, to the Creator. We ask today that after we heard all of these confessions, these testimonies, and the stories and the history of the doctrine of discovery, that not only the Obama administration fully endorses the Declaration, but that the House of Representatives here in Arizona and the Senate recognize further the rights of indigenous peoples. That when discussion takes place about indigenous issues, that indigenous peoples be at the table, not being discussed, but at the table. We call on religious leaders, religious organizations throughout the world, in this country, to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, to endorse the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to recognize the impact of the doctrine of discovery. We call on the traditional people of all the territories throughout the world to recognize and stand up for their fundamental human rights. So with that, our people have faced destruction, relocation, assimilation. And over these past decades, our Indian people, indigenous people, especially in this hemisphere, have been put in the front, but only they were cultural gestures and token recognition. We can't have that no more. Don't call us to bless a building if you're not going to invite us to the table about true discussion about the impact of indigenous peoples. Don't invite me to come say a prayer and then leave. Don't do that. Don't give me your token recognition. Don't give me your cultural gesture. That's not what I want. That's not what indigenous people want. The American Holocaust is real. Millions of people have been murdered. Millions of people. And today we unfortunately sit in the back of the room and listen to the discussion of indigenous peoples, and we have no real say. I encourage tribal governments to stand up, tribal government leadership to stand up and recognize their rightful place as leaders, as voted leaders, as nominated leaders, as recognized leaders, to stand up and fight for the rights of your people, for indigenous peoples. I encourage all of you to go home, watch this again, read the books from Professor Miller, Steve Newcomb, study the cases of Western Shoshone, look at the Winters Doctrine on the water rights of Arizona. Look at why these things have happened. Tell your children. Make sure they tell their children. It is important for us as indigenous peoples to stand up for our rights and our sovereignty. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all of you that have attended and those that are watching on the internet as it's streaming live. I encourage you to share this with the academic world, with sharing it with your families at home, and tribal governments to share this with their communities. Momsapo, Tamnyo. Thank you. This time I want to ask our elder brother, Jonah, to stand and to say a prayer for us. He welcomed us, he encouraged us, and he recognized our ancestors. And so Jonah is one of our traditional people we go to, along with Meldon, keepers of the songs and the language. So today we want to ask him to close the ceremony, and after that we ask that everyone, if you can, shake each other's hands, and we'll see you at Tonatierra. Thank you so much.